Chapter 5, Decompression Dive Tables and Dive Computers. As you have just learned, when you ascend and the ambient pressure decreases, the partial pressure of nitrogen also decreases and your body will off-gas nitrogen. The excess nitrogen passes from your body tissues into your blood. The nitrogen then passes from your blood to your lungs where you exhale nitrogen. This process occurs rapidly during the first few minutes after you ascend, but it takes many hours for your body's nitrogen level to return to normal. If you reduce the pressure on your body gradually, like we are doing with this bottle of soda, off-gassing occurs without a problem. However, if the change in pressure is sudden, the soda will bubble over just like the nitrogen in your tissues and can come out of solution and form bubbles in your body. These bubbles can damage tissues and can cause a painful condition known as decompression sickness or the bends. You must control the two factors that affect in- and off-gassing. You do this by controlling your dive time and depth. To do this, you must rely on information provided by dive tables, dive time calculators, and dive computers. You must also consider factors that can increase your chance of suffering DCS in situations where it might not normally occur. These factors include dehydration, fatigue, injuries, hard work during or shortly after a dive, the effects of drugs or alcohol, obesity or advanced age. In any case, you must be fit for diving and dive conservatively. For depths of 6.4 meters or 21 feet or deeper, dive time limits or no decompression limits have been established. The time spent at a given depth is not to exceed these limits, or you could experience DCS during or after your ascent. The United States Navy has established time limits for various depths. Recreational diving uses shorter time limits than those in the U.S. Navy tables. Reduced time limits have been incorporated into the NAUI dive tables and NAUI dive calculators as well as most dive computers. A certified entry-level NAUI scuba diver should not dive deeper than 18 meters or 60 feet. As a NAUI advanced scuba diver, you should not dive to depths deeper than 30 meters or 100 feet. The maximum depth for traditional recreational divers is 40 meters or 130 feet. To properly use dive tables, dive time calculators, and dive computers, you must understand the concept of residual nitrogen. It takes hours to fully absorb nitrogen into your body or fully eliminate it from your body. If you dive and absorb nitrogen, ascend to the surface, and then make another dive within 24 hours, you will still have nitrogen in your body from the first dive. You must always take the nitrogen remaining in your system from any previous dives into account when planning your next dive. The residual nitrogen reduces your time limits for any given depth on your next dive. The NAUI dive tables use a letter group designation to express the amount of residual nitrogen in your body. The letter A represents the smallest amount. The amount of nitrogen progresses through to the letter L. When you dive, a letter group from the tables designates the amount of nitrogen you have absorbed during the dive. As you spend time at the surface between dives, you're assigned a lower letter group as you off-gas nitrogen. When you start a new dive to a given depth, your letter group at that time determines the time representing the residual nitrogen in your body. The tables show you how to subtract this time from the normal dive time limits. The following terms apply to the NAUI dive tables. Dive schedule gives the depth and time of depth. It is expressed as depth over time. Maximum dive time is the time you spend at a given depth without having to do a required decompression stop. This is also known as maximum allowable dive time or no decompression limit. Decompression stop is the point in a dive where you stop at a specific depth for a specific time. Precautionary decompression stop is a stop at 5 meters or 15 feet for 3 minutes when you have not exceeded the maximum dive time. You should perform such a stop at the end of every dive. It is also known as a safety stop. Required decompression stop is the amount of time you must spend at 5 meters or 15 feet whenever you exceed the maximum dive time. Actual dive time, or ADT, is the elapsed time from the moment you begin your descent until the time you return to the surface. Time spent at your safety stop does not have to be included in the actual dive time when determining your letter group. Residual nitrogen is the excess nitrogen remaining in your body from any dive or dives before you've completely off-gassed. Surface interval time, or SIT, is the time you spent at the surface. Your letter group will change and move closer to the beginning of the alphabet, depending on how long you spend on the surface. Repetitive dive is any dive that you make before you have completely off-gassed from any previous dive or dives. Residual nitrogen time, or RNT, is the amount of time you must consider as already spent at a given depth for a planned repetitive dive. Adjusted maximum dive time, or AMDT, is the maximum dive time minus the residual nitrogen time for a repetitive dive to a given depth. Total nitrogen time, or TNT, is the sum of your residual nitrogen time and your actual dive time following a repetitive dive. You use this total to determine your new letter group. You must understand the following NAUI dive table rules completely. Ascend no faster than 9 meters or 30 feet per minute. You need a timing device and a depth gauge to measure your rate of ascent. Use the exact or next greater number listed in the table for your depth. For example, you round up a dive of 13 meters to 15 meters. Use the exact or next greater number listed in the table for your time. For example, you round up a dive of 41 minutes to 50 minutes. Use the deepest depth you've reached during your dive to determine the dive schedule for your dive. Always make your deepest dive first when making a series of dives. Consider any dive shallower than 12 meters or 40 feet to be a 12-meter dive. Surface interval time must be at least 10 minutes between dives. If your SIT is less than 10 minutes, you must consider your second dive a continuation of the first dive. NAUI recommends a surface interval time of at least 1 hour between dives. Use the next greater dive time if your dive time is particularly cold or strenuous. Avoid dives that take you right to the no decompression limit for any given depth and time combination. Always allow yourself enough time to make a slow, comfortable ascent with plenty of air. The NAUI dive tables are composed of 3 tables. Table 1, End of Dive Letter Group. Table 2, Surface Interval Time. And Table 3, Repetitive Dive Timetable. End of Dive Letter Group gives you a letter group at the end of your dive. It also gives you maximum dive time information for depths from 12 to 40 meters. The longer you stay on the surface between dives, the more excess nitrogen you eliminate. The surface interval timetable gives you credit for eliminating nitrogen by changing your letter group. Note the maximum in this table is 24 hours. All excess nitrogen is considered eliminated after you have been on the surface for 24 hours. Repetitive dive timetable provides your adjusted maximum dive time for your next dive and your residual nitrogen time based on your current letter group. You use this table twice for each repetitive dive. First, you use the table to find your adjusted maximum dive time when planning your dive. Next, you use the table to find your residual nitrogen time after you complete your dive. You add the residual nitrogen time to your actual dive time to find your total nitrogen time. You must systematically keep track of your depth, dive time, surface interval, letter group designations, and other information when working with the NAUI Dive Table or NAUI Dive Time Calculator. There is a NAUI Dive Planning worksheet on the back of your NAUI Dive Tables. This method of calculating your dive times is called the profile method. Write down your planned depth of 21 meters or 70 feet. Add 3 meters or 10 feet just in case you exceed your planned depth. Look at Table 1 and find the MDT for your planned depth. Add 3 meters or 10 feet to your planned depth and find the MDT for your contingency depth. Now it's time to dive your plan. Now record the information from your first dive and find your letter group designation. Record your start time, your deepest depth, and the time you surfaced. Record your ADT, remembering to subtract the 3-minute precautionary stop from the elapsed time. Add your ADT to your RNT to get your TNT. On Table 1, find your letter group using your deepest depth and the time corresponding to your TNT. Record the letter group. This completes the dive profile for your first dive. The length of your surface interval time will determine what your new letter group will be for planning your next dive. Record your SIT. Find your letter group. Look down the column to find your SIT. Find your new letter group. Record your new letter group. To plan a repetitive dive, you use the NAUI planning worksheet as you did for your first dive. However, you must use Table 3 to find your AMDT when planning your dive. Don't forget to add 3 meters to your depth and record that AMDT. Now it's time to dive your plan. Recording your repetitive dive is similar to recording your first dive. However, this time you have residual nitrogen in your body, and you must consider that before you find your new letter group. Find your RNT for your depth and letter group on Table 3 and record it. Add your ADT to your RNT to get your TNT. Go back to Table 1 to find your new letter group and record it. Intentionally exceeding the maximum dive time is unwise, unsafe, and discouraged. As you will learn in advanced or specialty training for deep diving, you must meet many requirements to carry out decompression dives properly. In normal recreational diving, decompression dives are still discouraged, even if you meet all the requirements. Diving is only a sport. Why risk injury? If you accidentally exceed a maximum dive time or adjusted maximum dive time, you must decompress by stages. You must keep your physical activity to a minimum during your decompression stop. If you surface and discover you omitted a required decompression stop, discontinue diving for 24 hours no matter how you feel. Breathe 100% oxygen if available. Drink plenty of fluids. Rest and watch for symptoms of DCS. If you suspect that you have DCS, you must seek medical help. Never go back into the water to try to make up for the omitted stop. If you only do one no decompression dive, you can fly after waiting 12 hours. If you do more than one no decompression dive in a day or do multiple days of diving, you should wait longer. The current recommendation is to wait 24 hours after the completion of your last dive. If you make dives that require a decompression stop or you omit a required decompression stop, wait more than 24 hours before flying. Atmospheric pressure decreases with altitude. To account for this difference, you need to use altitude conversion tables or the NAUI altitude tables and follow special procedures. Do not attempt high-altitude diving without first completing a high-altitude training program. The NAUI dive tables are the basis for the NAUI dive time calculator, which eliminates some calculations required with the tables. Once you are familiar with the NAUI dive tables, learning how to use the NAUI dive time calculator is easy. NAUI dive tables 1 and 3 are combined on the base plate. Letter group designations appear around the circumference, and ADTs in minutes appear in the window. End of dive letter groups appear to the right of the ADT numbers in the disk window. The calculator design eliminates the AMDT. It also eliminates adding the ADT to the RNT to obtain a TNT. However, the answers are the same as those obtained from the dive schedules using the NAUI dive table. For example, a no-group diver who plans a dive to 18 meters would have an MDT of 55 minutes. To find your letter group at the completion of your dive, let's use the same example of an 18-meter dive with an ADT of 23 minutes. The first time you do not exceed is 25 minutes. The end of dive letter group next to the 25 is E. To plan a repetitive dive, use Dive Table 2 on the disk to find your new letter group after your SIT. You were an E, and after a 1-hour SIT, you are now a D. If you want to return to 18 meters, your time limit is now 31 minutes. To find your end of letter group for a repetitive dive using an 18-meter dive and the letter group D and your ADT is 23 minutes, the first time you do not exceed is 26 minutes. The end of dive letter group next to the 26 is H. Dive planning with the NAUI Dive Time Calculator is simple. For example, you are a diver with a letter group of F and you want to dive for 25 minutes. You move the window back and forth and find that you can dive to 18 meters for 19 minutes or to 15 meters for 33 minutes. To avoid exceeding the maximum dive time, you know you can dive no deeper than 15 meters and stay no longer than 33 minutes. In some instances, the words "do not dive" appear in the calculator window. This means that you have too much residual nitrogen to permit a dive at the depth selected for a particular letter group. You will have to extend your surface interval to dive at that depth or dive at a shallower depth. When using the NAUI Dive Time Calculator, required decompression information is provided by a separate decompression timetable. The easiest way to determine how long you can dive and then ascend within the time limits is a dive computer. This is also the most expensive. Dive computers use theoretical and mathematical models to determine the time limits for the current depth and displays it for the diver. The big advantage with a dive computer is that it constantly recalculates as your depth changes during your dive. A dive computer does not count all of your dive time as having occurred at your deepest depth, as the dive tables do. A dive computer is an electronic device that can fail without warning. If a dive computer fails, your only option is to surface at the rate of ascent specified by the manufacturer and make a 3 to 5 minute precautionary decompression stop at 5 meters or 15 feet. Then you must stop diving for the period recommended by the manufacturer. You can't start with a fresh computer or use dive tables because you have an unknown amount of residual nitrogen in your system. When a dive computer is turned on, it must initialize itself. This is a process where the operating program is checked and loaded into the computer's memory. When this happens, the computer typically runs through a self-diagnostic test and checks all its functions. Some computers must be turned on with a switch before you enter the water. Other computers turn on automatically when you enter the water. If you must turn your computer on with a switch, do not turn it on at depth or after you started your descent, because your dive will not be recorded accurately. All computers can scroll before diving and between dives. Between dives, the computer accounts for your residual nitrogen and the time you've been on the surface. It shows your allowable maximum dive time for your next dive for each depth programmed in the computer. When a computer is in a dive mode, it will display data such as your current depth, maximum depth, water temperature, actual dive time, and the time you have left at your current depth. As you approach decompression status, computers give you a visual warning message. When this occurs, you must begin your ascent immediately, but at the proper rate. When your dive computer displays a ceiling, it means that you have an obligation to decompress. The ceiling depth is the depth of your first decompression stop. You must not ascend above the depth of that ceiling. If you require more than one stop, your computer will display another ceiling. An air-integrated computer will show you the amount of air left in your cylinder, as well as the amount of air time you have left. All dive computers will give you a warning signal when you exceed the ascent rate. Anytime you violate your computer's ascent rate, you increase your risk of DCS. Always monitor your computer carefully during ascent. If you ever see an out-of-range message, you've exceeded your computer's maximum depth range. Begin your ascent immediately and follow your computer's instructions to complete your decompression and ascent. During your surface interval, your computer will give you credit for off-gassing. You'll also be able to see the maximum time allowed at any depth, increasing as you stay out of the water. A surface interval of at least 1 hour is still recommended even if you are using a computer. Most computers will tell you when it is safe to fly based on their mathematical model. Even if you use a computer, you still need to log your dives. On most computers, you can call up log mode and see stored dive information. Other important rules when using a dive computer include a buddy cannot share one computer. Each diver must have their own computer. If you have been diving on tables and want to start diving with a computer, you must wait 24 hours after your last dive. If your computer must be turned on and off manually, do not turn it off until it indicates that off-gassing is complete, and do not make repetitive dives in one day to depths greater than 30 meters or 100 feet.